afternoon. Today we're going to talk about Office 365 and where you can store and share files. So there's basically two types of locations. One of them is OneDrive, and you guys may be familiar with that. OneDrive is your personal space up in Office 365, or it does live in SharePoint, but nobody has rights to it except for you. So the stuff you have in OneDrive is private unless you share it with somebody, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. On the other hand, we have SharePoint libraries, and so these are document libraries that live on a SharePoint site. And if you're not sure how to create one, you may need to talk to your administrator, because I'm not sure anybody would have permissions to create a SharePoint library. But multiple libraries can be created for any given SharePoint site. And within that SharePoint site, by default, anybody who has rights or permissions to the site would by default have permissions to any of the libraries on that site. That can be overwritten, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, you can break permissions and basically enforce stronger permissions at the library level if you wanted to. So the main difference between SharePoint libraries and OneDrive is that SharePoint libraries are intended to be team libraries shared by a group of people. And then OneDrive libraries are your own personal, like My Document space. All right. Let's go take a look at a SharePoint page real quick. So within a SharePoint page, you can edit it and you can add libraries to the page. So the way you edit a SharePoint page is you come up here. If you have rights, you would click on where it says page and then click edit. Now you can see there's blocks of areas on the page, and I can insert different what they call web parts. So the way you do that is you come up here to insert, you would select a web part, and here's your different types. And this, for instance, is your default document library. You can also create custom document libraries. But if I wanted to just drop this document library in there, I can just simply drag it over where I want it. Should be coming. Let's try it over here. Oh, click the add button. And there we've added a document library to the page. This library can live on multiple pages within the site. It's referencing the same library, so any changes made to that library will be reflected on any of the pages that it shows up on. Once we're done editing the page, we can just click Save. And now that document library lives on that page. To drill into the library, there's a hyperlink, and I can just click on it there. So let's take a closer look at managing the library itself. So in the library, you've got documents that you can add by dragging and dropping, or you can click Upload. So let's drop a document in there. So I've got documents here. Let's go, we'll just take this and we'll just drop it right there. Tells me one item is uploading. And it'll show up here briefly. Oh, bigger file than I meant to drop there. Hold on, let's get a smaller file. There we go. That one showed up. So there it is. That's how you can easily drop a file on there. You can also just click upload files, folders, and just browse for it the old-fashioned way. So once you have a file in there, you can, if you hover over, you'll see this button, which means you can share it. So if you want to share this with somebody within your organization or even outside the organization, you can click the share button once it lives in SharePoint. And you'll see with SharePoint, the default is I'm going to share it with people within my organization can open this link. If I wanted to share it with somebody outside of my organization, I can click that and select other options. I can also allow editing or not allow editing. And then you would type the email address of the person you want to share it with. So I'll share this with Trevor. And he'll get an email with that link. And then he can edit it. Other things you can do, if I click on the 3 dots, I get a big drop-down list. And if I hover over open, I can either open this in a browser or in the app. So this is a CSV file, which is the native app for it would be Excel. So if I say open an app, it's going to actually launch Excel. If I open in browser, it's going to launch Excel in a browser because these are called web apps. So basically, I get almost the full functionality I get almost the full functionality of Excel within a browser by just opening it within the browser. So if you're working from a remote location like a kiosk that doesn't have Excel installed, you still get all that functionality. And if I tell it to open in an app, prompts me to open in Excel. And it opened it in my other window, but here it is. Okay, so other nice stuff you can do here. You can copy a link to it. I can manage access to this file. But really, one of the cool things here is called version history. So I can click on version history for a given document. Doesn't usually take this long. There it is. Okay, so it's showing me previous versions of this document. And I can go back to one of the previous versions and I can view, restore, or delete any previous version. So versioning can be turned on or off. With most SharePoint libraries, it's on by default. So let's take a look at where you would manage that.
Is now joining.
So this is our document library. If I want to go to settings for the library, I can come up here, click the little gear icon and go to library settings. And here are all my settings for the library. And we talked about versioning. By default, it creates major versions each time you edit the document. We can also have it instead create minor versions, which means it does like a .1 or whatever after. And by default, it's going to create up to 500. It's going to store up to 500 different versions. So I can make a lot of changes before they start rolling off the bottom. This is where we talked about permissions for the library. If you are an administrator and you have rights to do this, this is where I can break inheritance. By default, everyone who is a member of the site, this SharePoint site, is going to have permissions to this library. But I can click this button here that says Stop Inheriting Permissions, and then I can explicitly assign permissions to this library. So it is possible to break inheritance. Like I said, it's not recommended because then it's really harder as an administrator to know who has rights to what if you've done that. So generally, you want to use your SharePoint site as your base level of permissions. So other cool things you can do within a library. One major thing is called metadata. And let me just go back to the library real quick. You'll see this thing that says add a column. So a column represents metadata. So it's some piece of information about that file, like perhaps the department that file belongs to, or it could be any type of categorization you want to make on that file, and we can actually use metadata to create filters so that we're only seeing files that represent. So right now my filter is all documents, but I can create different views based on filters, and I can, for instance, if I want to say, what would be a good example? So let's create a column called, we'll just say required yes or no. So we'll say, is this a required document? Yes or no? Default value, yes. We'll save it. Okay, so now I've got a column called required. There's no data in it yet because it wasn't there before, but I can go ahead and populate that here. So we'll put this one to yes, and then we'll put this one to no.
And John, it looks like we have a question submitted by David. Is it possible to set permissions to a single file or only the document library?
Yeah, good question. The answer in SharePoint is no. You cannot set permissions on a file level, only on the library, the document library level. All right, so now I've got this field where I've got where it's required yes or no. So let's go ahead and create a view for this library where I'm only seeing things that meet certain criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into my library settings. And here's my views. I've only got one view currently called all documents. That's your default view. So I'm going to create a new view, and we'll make it a standard view, but there's some different options here, such as calendar. That will actually look like a calendar. Datasheet view, Gantt view, which is project management. So we're going to go ahead and do a standard view, like I said. And here's my available columns So there's other columns that we didn't see in that other view, that the all documents view, because they weren't checkboxed. These are the ones that are checkboxed by default. But there is other information, what we call metadata, that belongs to any given file, like your created by, your created date. So there's a number. There's already a bunch of metadata associated with any given file that automatically gets created. So here we go. I can select the columns that I want to have show up, and that new one I just created called required. Where is it? There it is. It's already checked. And I can check other ones if I want. Now I can create sorts and I can create filters. So a sort would be the order that they show up in. By default, it's going to sort by name, I believe, but we can change that. We can pick any column we want it to sort by. And we can show ascending, that's typical. And if there's duplicates, then we can sort by created. That'll be the created date. Okay, and then we'll create a filter. In this view, we want to only show items that our new field required is equal to yes. Okay, so that's going to be our filter. And we're going to give this view a name. Click OK. Now, it's showing me my required view. You can see up here, it tells me the view I'm looking at. If I go to all documents, I see all the documents. If I go to, is it required? I'm only seeing the documents that are required based on this field that I created. And that's how metadata works. All right, so let's talk about this button here called sync. So if you were to look in File Explorer, you'll see I've got a number of different things that show up here. Here's a SharePoint site and a number of libraries that live under that site that I'm subscribed to. The green check mark means that they're fully synced. So basically, by clicking that sync button, it's going to create this here. And it's going to create a local copy of all those files for that library on my local computer. So I'll have local access to those files. So what that means is, even if I were to get on an airplane and not have internet, I would still have access to these files. And the next time I connect up to the internet, these files will sync up. Any changes I made will sync back to the SharePoint site. And so this is also true of OneDrive. You also have that sync there. So let's go take a look at OneDrive now that we've done SharePoint. And to get that, all you have to do to get that to show up is click this sync button from the SharePoint site. And that'll create that location in your File Explorer. And you can access it from any of your other apps, including like Word or whatever. So if I were in Word and I were to go to Open, I can see all those other sites. If I go to this PC, or let's say I go browse. Yeah, so there's all that stuff I was showing you before in File Explorer. Now I can just select on one of those and I can open files from here and save files to there from any app. All right, so let's go take a look at OneDrive. OneDrive is essentially a SharePoint library, so it's going to look and feel about the same. Same thing, I've got all these same options here. I can open from a browser or open an app. I can share this, and we'll come back to that. I've got version history here in my my OneDrive, so you can see that here's all these different versions of this one document. And this is a document that I did share out with some other people, and it tells me who made these changes. Now, I did not require that they sign in, but that's something you can do when you share it, and I'll show you. But since I didn't require that they sign in, if somebody edited this document without signing in, it just shows guest contributor. It doesn't show their name. Whereas the case with Stacy, she was signed in when she edited it. So let's take a look at what happens when I try to share a file from OneDrive. By default with OneDrive, unlike SharePoint, it says anyone with this link can edit. That means if I were to forward this, or I send it to Stacy or Trevor, and then they forward it out to somebody else, even if that person's not a member of my organization, even though I didn't send them the link, because that link that was forwarded to them was marked anyone with this link can edit this document, that means anybody who has that link can edit that document, whether I sent it to them or not. So it's something to keep an eye on. If you're worried about security of the document, you're going to want to drop this down and change it. Maybe limit it to people within your organization, or maybe just limit it to specific people that you want to share it with. And they can be within or without of your organization. And again, you can allow editing or not. And you can even set a password for access to that file at this point. So this is a way, if you're sharing the file, that you can set some security on it. I think, David, you had that question. So here's a way, if I am sharing it out, I can put a password on that access. Okay. One nice, the great thing about putting files in OneDrive or SharePoint is that you can share them with people outside your organization. So if you've got large files that you need to share, or it's just a better way of doing it than just dropping them an email and blasting them out to people and making multiple copies of it. With this, let me go ahead and share a document with Trevor, and I'll show you how, because it lives here in OneDrive or even in SharePoint, we can co-edit that document. So let me share this with Trevor. And I'm going to go ahead and limit it to people within my organization. That means he needs to be authenticated as him. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and open this document. And I'll just open it in a browser. Okay, Trevor, can you go ahead and access the document I just shared with you?
Yeah, sure thing. I'm signing in right now.
And you can only do this when it actually lives in a shared location like OneDrive or SharePoint. This doesn't work if you've stored it on your local C drive or someplace like that and send out an email. Okay, you can see Trevor's typing. Here's his name here. I can see Trevor is up here. So he's in the document at the same time as me, and he's actually typing stuff and moving stuff around. And if I were to do something at the same time, Trevor would see what I did as well. So this is called co-editing, and this is one of the great benefits of storing files up in SharePoint or OneDrive. All right, and I think that's everything I have today. So if there's any questions, we're open to questions. Anybody have any questions? Any of the content or details?
Nothing in the chats as of yet. And a reminder, I am recording the video, so if you do need a refresher, we are posting this. I'll try to get this again posted to YouTube before the end of today.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending. And if you think of something later, go ahead and send us an email, and we can respond to it.
Oh, looks like a question just came in.
Okay.
Can you show us where you set the version history limit in OneDrive?
I didn't show you that but that I showed you in SharePoint. But we can go to OneDrive settings, go to the gear icon up here. So it's essentially the same. And then more settings. Actually, it's not giving us that. No, you're not going to be able to change it. It's just on by default. Your administrator can probably change it. But essentially, versioning's on by default, so you'll have versioning. But you don't have control over it.
Thanks for the question. Are there any other questions?
All right, thank you. You're welcome.
Is now exiting.